One of the most obscure holidays, but nevertheless considered to be a major holiday by our sages, is the 15th of Av. 15th day of the month of Av, 6 days after the sad fast day of Tisha B'Av. The Talmud in the Mishnah gives us 6 reasons why we celebrate this holiday. And the Talmud, rather the Mishnah, says that Jewish people never had holidays as joyous, as great as the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur, but that's for another time. What's so special about this day? So the 6 reasons, if you look at the common denominator of those 6 reasons, they all deal with removing separation. There could be separation between God and the Jewish people. There could be separation between one generation and another. There could be separation between one person and another. And if you can find the secret to healing separation, you can find ways of dealing with every problem that exists within relationships. So the first reason, historically, is the fact that when the Jews were in the desert and they cried when they heard the negative report, the slanderous report about Israel from the spies that were sent to scout the land, and because they cried that night, which happened to be the night of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which centuries later became the day in which the 2 temples were destroyed and other major tragedies. So they cried that night, and God says, you're crying now for no good reason. This will be a day of crying in the future. But in addition, God said, you will not live to see the promised land. So anyone over the age of 20 did not exceed the age of 60. What did they do? Every Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of that day of crying, they dug graves, and everyone went into the graves, everyone over 20, and the next morning, thousands did not come out alive. It was destined that they would die that year. And they repeated this every year until the last 9th of Av, that they were in the desert. They all dug their graves, they went into the grave. The next morning, they came out, they pinched themselves, we're alive. We probably miscalculated. So they went into the graves the next night, and the next night, and the next night, until the 15th, when they saw a full moon, and the 9th of Av is before a full moon. They realized they didn't miscalculate, but God had given them a reprieve. So here, there was a separation between the generation that perished in the desert and the generation that lived to go into the promised land. What exactly could we learn from this in terms of our own relationships? What was the problem? Why did they want to stay in the desert? Very often, there are many conventional theorists who say that the Jewish people suffer from a slave mentality. Chassidus says, no, that's not really totally true. There's a kernel of truth in that. Maybe until Sinai, they still had a slave mentality. But after Sinai, they had a total transformation. On the contrary, they had a desert mentality. What I mean by that is, as Chassidus explains, they were so accustomed to living in a perfectly secure place. They had clouds of glory surrounding them, taking care of the weather. They had manna from heaven. They had water from a well. They were lacking nothing physically. So what did they do with themselves for those 40 years? They devoted their lives to spiritual pursuits, to meditating on God, meditating on the teachings of the Torah. This was, as our sages refer to them as Dar Dea, a generation of knowledge. These people were steeped in the knowledge of God. And that's why they didn't want to go to the promised land, because the promised land meant they're going to have to change, have a paradigm shift. They're going to have to detach themselves from spirituality and enter into the mundane world of cultivating the soil, of fighting battles. They would be involved in the materialistic pursuits of existence in a land like Israel, like any other country, and this they could not tolerate. They wanted to live spiritual lives. What does that have to do with our relationships? Our soul doesn't want to come down into this world, we're told. In the Ethics of the Fathers, it says, Ba'al karchach atachai, you were alive against your will. The soul wants to be in the spiritual, godly domain where it is before it enters this world. So it has to be thrust into a body. Well, Chassidus tells us that doesn't end with birth. Not until a person gets married, enters into this relationship of marriage, is the soul really in this world. The soul is still connected to its source and still wants to escape, doesn't want to be involved in a relationship, because a relationship means that you have to detach yourself from your own selfish interests, as far as the body is concerned, and even from your own spiritual interests. The soul wants to soar to the heights. It doesn't want to stay down here. Tanya compares it to a flame, a flickering flame, which is a biblical verse. Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam, the candle of God is the soul of man. The soul wants to flicker upwards and leave and be detached from this world. And it's forced to stay in this world. But that means that in terms of relationships, we don't want to change our whole way of life where we're no longer free to be who we want to be on our own, from the body's perspective and from the soul's perspective. Now with marriage, we have responsibility for another. Our lives are not lived for ourselves to satisfy our own selfish interests, but to take care and contribute to the other. And that is a challenge at the time of marriage. So when this event on the 15th of Av occurred, what did that mean? That generation was healed from the desert mentality that their forebears, that their parents and grandparents maintained. They didn't want to leave the world, the cocoon, the physical cocoon and the spiritual cocoon. The next generation that came out of their graves came out of that mentality, and then they were able to continue with their relationships. What happens when the body is selfish, which is basic biology? As soon as a baby is born, it wants to be taken care of from the moment it's born until it becomes an adult. The child is always dependent and always wants to get something from someone else without it having to do anything. And the soul also has its own selfish interest. It wants to be connected to God. It wants to leave this physical world. But that is not God's will. God's will is that the soul remain in this world and the soul engage the world to make the world a dwelling place for God. In the Sefer Yetzirah, the earliest work of Kabbalah, it says, Imratz libcha, if your heart races, shuv le'echad, return, retreat to the one. And Chassidus explains, if your heart races, if your soul is passionate and wants to leave this existence, it wants to shirk responsibility to deal with a physical world, return to the realization that God's goal and mission that he gives us, body and soul, is echad, is to bring God's oneness to the world, to demonstrate that God is all over, that God pervades all of existence, and there's this unity to the whole universe because God is present in everything. And that is what this generation experienced when they came out of their graves and they entered into the promised land. They realized that a relationship requires a paradigm shift. You're here for a higher mission. God willing, in the next message, we'll talk about the second reason why we celebrate the 15th of Av and how it relates to our relationships.